Okay, so welcome to Chapter 5. In Chapter 5, we are going to be discussing how to apply the concept of process costing, and we'll also talk about some of the similarities and some of the differences between how it works with the job order costing that you just completed in Chapters 3 and Chapter 4. Okay, so under the first objective, we'll talk about the cost flows in a process costing system and a job costing system. And one of the things you're going to find out is that they are very similar in nature. Okay, there's not a lot of differences. The real difference is in how to come up with the actual average of the cost, but the idea of cost flow, when we're talking about, for example, a raw material that flows to a work in process, that flows to finished goods, and then when that goes to the cost of goods sold, all that, like I said previously in previous lecture illustrations, is really going to be the same, as well as the terminology. So the concepts of product cost, direct material, direct labor, overhead, again, all of that will be exactly the same. So as we talk about job and process costing differences, I think you're going to find out that there's actually more similarities than there are actual differences, although there are some differences. But as you recall, as you were back in Chapter 3 and Chapter 4, you tracked everything by the job because that's what is called job costing or job order costing. And within that, within each job, you're going to have product cost number 1, direct material, product cost number 2, direct labor, and then your third product cost, which is your overhead, that you're actually going to allocate that to individual jobs. You then basically, once you complete the job, it flows to finished goods, and then it goes to cost of goods sold once you've sold it. Again, none of that's going to be different. The one difference you're going to find in this chapter, it's all about how to come up with the average cost per unit. And just to kind of, in a nutshell, to tell you, think of process costing as you're going to basically track or average the cost, not by the job, but by department. Whereas the job, you tracked it by the actual job order or the job cost record. That's basically this first part. And again, as you're looking at this illustration, this is again from the job costing. You'll notice that again, here are your three basic product costs right here: direct material, direct labor, manufacturing overhead. It flows to the actual job. And think of this as that's really your work in process right there. And then once you finish the job, then it goes to finished goods. And then once you sell it, it becomes expensed as cost of goods sold. Again, down below, here's your T accounts. Again, product cost number 1. This is your direct labor, number 2, number 3. So I don't know why they put wages payable there. They should just put direct labor. But again, everything here flows to work in process. It flows to WIP or to finished goods, and then it flows to cost of goods sold. That's the same. That's pretty much going to be the same for process costing as well, except for how you actually come up with the cost. Now, again, the thing about process costing is most of the time the idea is you are mass producing some sort of homogeneous type of product. It's the same type of product. So this could be cereal, textiles, bricks, soda pop, basically, could be beer, stuff you buy every day at the store. And so what's going to happen is you're going to track the cost by the department. You're going to accumulate the cost and move it from essentially one department to the next. So the stuff you're going to be reading here, it's really still the same idea. It's still going to be, if you're talking about manufacturing, it's still going to be raw materials to work in process to finished goods to cost of goods sold. That's not going to change. The change is going to be is how do you actually come up with the average cost to make the product? And that's what we're going to get into in the next few slides. But the basic idea of cost flow is really the same. Think of process costing as you're really going to have multiple work in process departments, whereas in a job order costing setup, you had one work in process for each job. For process costing, you're going to have several work in process departments or accounts for each particular department that a company's using. And again, if you just kind of look down below, again, it's the same 3 product cost. And notice in this case, they've got all their different departments. This could be Department A, that could be Department B, that could be Department C, for example. But you'll notice the idea here is that you essentially have multiple work in process departments. You still have your 3 product costs. That's not going to change. All of these are basically going to be moving to all these individual departments, which you're going to have a work in process for one department and a work in process for another department and so forth. But notice at the end of the day, once you've finished it, where does it go? It goes to finished goods. And then once you've sold it, then it becomes cost of goods sold. Okay, now to wrap up this particular section of the objective, they call these the building blocks of process costing. It's basically some terminology things that's going to happen in the next few slides. One thing you need to know is what is a conversion cost? Conversion cost is defined as direct labor plus manufacturing overhead. So notice this is what I typically call product cost number 2, and that's product cost number 3. But your direct labor plus manufacturing overhead is called conversion cost. We're going to get into this idea of equivalent units, but think of this as that's basically going to be like a weighted average production number that we're going to be using. Write this in there. So whatever we come up with here is going to be some sort of weighted number that we're going to use to average our cost per unit. And then in terms of what they talk about inventory cost flow assumptions, there's 2 of them. We're primarily going to be doing the weighted average. The first in, first out method you would get in a cost accounting course. So our focus in this class will be on the weighted average method of cost flows, and that's going to all figure into basically using equivalent units to come up with that average cost. And you're going to see this in the next few slides. Okay, so equivalent units, again, the basic idea here is think of this. This is going to be how many units you've produced. And the question is how do you come up with it? And we're going to show you that in the next few slides. But when we come up with an average cost to make one whole equivalent unit, the equivalent unit is essentially a weighted average number of all units that are in production. It's basically trying to look at everything as partially complete plus fully complete. But the idea would be is to give you a true weighted average cost per unit of units made. So equivalent units of production. As I wish they would call it equivalent units of production. That would actually be a better title for it. But at the end of the day, everything is cut off and they'll say calculate the equivalent units. So if you look at this particular definition, equivalent unit says any amount of work done during a period in terms of, notice it says fully complete units of output. So that's the key. Fully complete could also include, I'm going to write this as my note, include partially completed as well. Okay, so partially completed units have to be counted with the fully completed. That's going to give you your equivalent unit. And in order to do that, a lot of the problems will give us percentages of completion along the way, and that's what we'll use to do our averaging in terms of our equivalent units. And again, like I said before, the cost flow assumption we're going to be using is weighted average method. We are not doing the FIFO method. The weighted average method is what we're going to be doing, and that's coming up in a couple slides. Okay, so they're going to walk you through a few steps. I typically actually do, I call it 4 steps. In my class, they say we're going to do a 5-step process to come up with an average cost to make. So again, using the weighted average assumption, let's just kind of talk about their 5 steps. So the first step, number 1, says we want to summarize the flow of physical units. That's similar to what I do in class. Step 2 says basically get the equivalent units. Again, that's the same as my step 2. And I typically combine step 3 and 4 together, but step 3 it says summarize total cost to account for and then to compute the cost per equivalent unit. So I tend to kind of do steps 3 and 4 together in one step. That's okay, it's the same thing. And then the very last step is to basically do your allocation, is to allocate those costs per unit to units that are both completed and units that are not completed, and that of course is going to be ending work in process. Okay, so what you want to know in step 1 is how to get the total physical units. So if I can direct you down to this right here, there's basically going to be a couple different ways you can calculate it. I'm going to write it up at the top as well. So you could either take the beginning work in process units, which could be given in the problem, plus any units that have been started during the period. That's going to equal your total physical units, which is what they're showing you right down there. Notice it says beginning work in process plus units started equals total physical units. Now, the other way to calculate total physical units is right down below. It's if you take units completed and transferred out plus your ending WIP. Notice that also equals your total physical units. So when you see this in step 1, they like to say that you're basically reconciling all of your units because these two numbers, 50,000 and 50,000, those should be the same. So it's a kind of a nice way to kind of double check your work. So at step one, again, two ways to get it. Beginning WIP plus units started equals total physical, or take units completed plus ending WIP. That also equals total physical. That's step one. Now, before we get to the next step, you'll notice that they've already kind of put part of step two on there. Again, step two, notice is what we're doing here is we got the physical flow. Now we're going to calculate the equivalent units. And look at how they label this. You've got direct materials, which is product cost number one. And then they have a column that says conversion cost, which essentially is direct labor plus your overhead. So there's your product cost number two and product cost number three. So just so you know, they're still looking at all the three product costs, except they're combining labor and overhead. So again, in the next step, we'll show you how they'll get the equivalent units. That'll be the step two. Okay, so you'll notice in this particular exercise how to get the physical flow. Let's read this. We've got Babs and Soda. It says they have 19,000 units in beginning work in process. It says during September, 100,000 units were started in production. And on September 30th, 29,000 units were left in ending WIP. Summarize the physical flow schedule. So what you can do here is you can say, okay, beginning work in process, which was 19,000 units. It says that they started, I'm going to write this out, started, looks like it says 100,000. So if you add these two together, your total physical flow would be 119,000. Now, the other way to get it, of course, you could say, how many units did you complete plus ending work in process. Now, you'll notice that both of these numbers should add up to 119,000. So what I like to do is I just go ahead and copy that over, and I look at what else is given in the problem, and they tell you that September 30th you had 29,000 units left in ending work in process. So here's the plug number, and sometimes this is how they'll expect you to do it, is to know the formulas. If completed plus ending WIP should equal the total physical, which it does, and you know that ending work in process is 29,000, here's the question mark. Can you come up with that completed? And the answer should be yes. You just have to take 119,000 and subtract out 29,000, and guess what? That'll be your plug number to figure out the completed number of units. Okay, so again, just to kind of summarize what I just put on the previous slide again, they gave you beginning WIP, they gave you started. All you have to do is add 19 and 100, and of course, there's going to be your total physical. And then, of course, you go down to the second one. Notice they wrote it out again, completed and transferred out. They told you ending WIP was 29. And again, what I tell my students, I go ahead and just copy this number down because you know it has to be 119,000. So that way you can simply subtract out the 29,000 to back into that units completed. And of course, again, here's the slide just showing you, of course, you would add these together, and then here's your 119. And then remember, simply just copy that down there. We know that's 119,000, and then you can back into the completed and transferred out. And again, here's the next slide, again, showing you that they basically just copied that there, and then you just do the math, and of course, you'll get 90,000 for completed and transferred out. And then again, here's the final one. Here's the actual final answer. And I'm just going to remind you again, this 90,000, that was a plug number because you know the rules, you know the relationship in the formulas now. Step one, total physical units. Okay, so in this slide, we've got the equivalent units exhibit. Notice down below in step two up here, we've got direct material and conversion. And then what you see down below, see how they put, you got the 40,000 and 10,000 here, and then 40,000 and 2,500 right there. Now, of course, I'm going to walk you through where they come up with these numbers in the next couple slides. But the basic idea is what you do is you use this column right here. And in my classes, I tend to add a column that I call percent complete. And of course, if you think about the logic here, if you completed and transferred out, that's always going to be what I call 100% complete. And I basically just take 100% times 40,000, and I would move that right here for direct materials. And it's basically the same number for conversion. When I go to ending work in process of this 10,000, what they should have told you is that of those 10,000, 25% is complete with respect to conversion, but 100% is complete with respect to your direct materials. They should have given that to you. They didn't tell you, but I'm telling you that's what it is. So in the problems, we'll tell you stuff like this, or what they'll tell you is that materials are, quote, added at the beginning of production. So anytime it tells you that, it's implied that materials are said to be 100% complete. So what I do for materials, I would take the materials times 100%. That gives me the 10,000. And then I take the conversion percent, which they have to give you, times the 10,000. That's where they would come up with that 2,500. And then what you do is you add these down. For direct materials, you say it's 50,000 equivalent units of production. For conversion, it's 42,500 for equivalent units of production. And then you're going to basically use this as you come up with your average cost to make. Okay, so let's look at this example from your book. It's short exercise 5.6, where it says compute the equivalent units. And it's basically wanting you to get up till step 2. So we're going to have to get the total physical flow, and we're also going to have to get the equivalent units of production. So it talks about the frying department of crinkled chips have 110,000 partially completed units in work in process at the end of March. It says all of the direct materials have been added to these products, to these units, but the units were only 68% of the way through the conversion process. It says, in addition, 1,200,000 units have been completed and transferred out to the frying department, to the packaging department during the month. So the questions they want us to deal with are, number 1, how many equivalent units of direct materials and equivalent units of conversion are associated with the 1,200,000 that were transferred out? Part 2 says compute the equivalent units of direct material and equivalent units of conversion associated with the 110,000 partially completed. And then part 3 says what are the total equivalent units of direct materials and total equivalent units of conversion for the month. Okay, so we'll need this 68%, by the way, because that's going to help us do our math for converting the conversion cost. The key here is also it says all of the direct materials had been added to these units. So regardless of anything, think of all of your direct materials as 100% complete. So regarding with your equivalent units, whatever your units are given, guys, that's going to be your equivalent units for direct materials regardless. So the 110,000 and the 1,200,000, all of that is going to be 100% complete for your direct materials regardless of what they're going to do. Okay, so notice in this setup, notice that based on what they've given in the problem, they told you that they had transferred out 1,200,000 units and that the ending work in process was 110,000. So that basically tells you that your total physical units should be 1,310,000. Now, the fact that the direct materials are 100% complete because it says they've all been added, and of course anything that's been transferred out is always 100% complete, I can go ahead and just move this number over for both, first of all, both for direct materials and also for your conversion, all right? And then regarding this ending work in process, that's also going to be 100% for materials, like I just said. So we already know that number for materials is going to be 1,310,000. The only question mark is what's going to be that number for conversion? And I believe the problem said it was 68% for conversion. And then you'd have to take that 68% and multiply that by the 110,000. That's going to give you the plug number there to get that equivalent unit for the ending WIP for conversion, and then you just add it together to get the total. So in this case, you'll get 74,800. Again, that's the 68% of the 110. So if you look at this, you've got, here's your materials. Notice it's 100%. It's the same as your total physical because it's 100% complete for everything. For conversion, it's basically the only thing that's not complete is that 68%, and that's that partial that we just calculated. You add that together, and then that's going to be your equivalent units for your conversion. Okay, now for step 3, now we're going to move in and look at the dollar amounts. We're going to look at the actual cost because you have all of your units summarized. So in step 3, we're going to get all the costs together, and all the costs, basically, it's everything in work in process. Everything in work in process is going to include, notice, a beginning work in process plus what we like to call cost added. And your cost added, just to remind you, again, will be direct material, direct labor, and your manufacturing overhead. So in this problem, again, note they're saying in this case, they're actually telling you that of this 68,000 of conversion, they're telling you how much was direct labor and how much was overhead. Okay, fine. Direct materials was 140. Notice that the beginning WIP balances were 0. So basically, once we take the beginning plus anything we've added, the $208,000 represents your total cost of everything, and these costs are broken down into the categories, again, of your main product cost of direct materials and conversion, which is direct labor and overhead. What you do with these costs, the next step is you're going to be dividing by your equivalent units, okay, to get your cost per equivalent unit. That'll be step 4. Okay, so this is short exercise 5.7 from your textbook, and this is the step 3 where they're wanting you to come up with the total cost to account for. Just remember, you want everything that is in work in process, which includes any sort of beginning balances. So in this problem, it says McIntyre Company's work in process account had a $68,000 beginning balance. That was May 1st. They actually break it down. They told you that of this 68, 43 of it is direct materials and 25 of it would be your conversion. And then they tell you that during the month of May, the following costs were incurred. Also think these are the costs that also were added. So you notice here's your 3 product costs. Product cost number 1, direct materials. Here's product cost number 2, direct labor. And product cost number 3, manufacturing overhead. And again, they want you to come up with the total cost to account for. So just remember, you're going to have to take the beginning dollar balance, and then it's basically add the cost added is what they want you to come up with. And then that's going to be the total cost to account for. And just remember to keep it in its category. So you'll have a direct material category and you'll have a conversion category. And basically you just have to add up all your total dollar amounts. And then in the next slide, we'll show you the totals. So you notice here's your basic template. And again, just to remind you, remember conversion cost is your direct labor plus your overhead. So this makes up your product cost number 1, product cost number 2, and product cost number 3. And again, all you got to do is take any beginning dollar amounts which they've given you. You're going to add to it dollars, I call them cost added, and then that's going to be the total cost to account for. And then here you go, here's this problem. So they gave you, again, of that beginning 68,000, they gave you the breakdown between what was direct material and what was conversion. And then they told you basically what was added during the month of May. You just have to add it to the right column. So for total direct materials, it's going to be 146. For total conversion, it's going to be 187. And if you add those two together, you get 333,000. That's your total dollars to account for. Okay, so now we're back to the exhibit. This was from the previous slides where we were they had given you the total cost to account for in a different problem. It's the same idea. The fourth step is you want to get the cost per equivalent unit. So again, what you do is you take your total cost for each category. So in this case, direct materials total cost to account for was 140. For conversion, it was 68,000. And all you do is divide by the total equivalent units. So if you go back to the previous slides, I think it was 50,000 for materials and it was 42.5 for conversion. And then here's what you're looking for. It's called the cost per equivalent unit. In this case, it'd be $2.80 for direct materials and $1.60 for conversion. And then what sometimes you might want to do is then you could even combine these by adding the 280 plus the 160. And in that case, you're going to get $4.40 per equivalent unit. That would be for one whole equivalent unit that would have been completed and transferred. Okay, and then the final step is once you come up with your averages, the last step is basically to assign those total costs to what was either completed and transferred out and also to your ending work in process. So again, you want to take the total dollar amount and you're simply going to allocate it to what you completed and to what's not completed, which of course is ending work in process. So if you go back to your steps, you'll notice that of course you had completed and transferred out. In this case was 40,000 units. And in this case, they took 40,000, multiplied it by $2.80 for materials, and for conversion, they multiplied that by $1.60. Now, an alternate way to do that is if you had combined the 280 and the 160, of course, you get $4.40. If you take 440 and multiply that by 40,000, you're going to find out that that's going to give you the same answer. So that's another way you could have done it as well. Now, the ending work in process, you go to that ending WIP equivalent units number. it was 10,000 for direct materials, and it was 2,500 for conversion. And then again, you multiply by the 280 for materials and the $1.60 for conversion. You multiply those out, you get 28,000 and 4,000. You add those together, you get a total of 32. If you add that to the 176, you just reconciled all your costs and you've assigned them. So to go backwards, so if our total cost to account for it was 208,000, we just determined that of that, 176,000 goes to the next department, and you're still working on 32,000 because that is what is left in ending work in process. Okay, so for this is exercise 5-10 from your textbook, and this is the process costing step 5. And so in this particular problem, they've already done all the steps for you. In fact, they've already given you the cost per equivalent unit, and then again, they just want you to assign the cost. So it says, during the month, they completed and transferred out 410,000 units, and they had 86,000 partially completed in ending WIP. And then they tell you that the breakdown of these partially completed units were 69,000 for direct materials and 50,000 for equivalent units. So the requirements are right here. Number one, it says they want you to determine the total cost that should be assigned to the following: completed and transferred out and ending WIP. They want to know what's the total cost to account for, so we can figure that one out. And then they want to know what is the average cost of making one unit. Now that one could actually be answered almost right away, because all you have to do is take the 420 and add that to the 275, and in this case it looks like you would get $6.95. As I told you in the previous slide, that's kind of like a shortcut, because it's just basically that is the average cost if you just combine those. Again, 420 plus the 275 would actually be 695. That would be actually the answer to question number 3. But in the next slide, I'll use their little template and we'll walk you through how to get these assignments of cost allocations. Okay, so for the cost completed and transferred out, so again, you completed and transferred out 410,000 units. And like I told you before, if you combine these two, the 420 and the 275, again, you're going to get $6.95. All you have to do is multiply that by 410. 2,849,500 is how many dollars you're going to transfer out. Now, to determine what's going to be in the ending work in process, they gave you the breakdown. So of the direct materials, it was 69,000, and for conversion, it was 50,000. So now you have to go back to the individual cost per equivalent units for direct materials, and again for conversion, which they've already given you, and then you just have to multiply those out, and you can add it together, and then that's going to give you your total ending work in process balance. Now, once you've done that, you can back into the total cost. So if you just take the 2,849,000 and add that to the 427,300, that's going to give you this amount, which is your total dollar amount, $3,276,800, or $800. And then the last step, I already told you, the actual cost of making one unit. Again, here it is right here, the 420 plus the 275, and $6.95 is your answer. Okay, so the next step is to show you how to do the journal entries for a process costing system. And again, there's a lot of similarities between this and the job order costing system. We still essentially have the same cost flows, the same account. So what I mean by that is your raw materials still flow to work in process, which also flows to finished goods. And again, the only real difference you're going to see is that you're going to have multiple work in process departments. That's really the big difference. So in this particular example, again, up here they talk about again the similarities. It's essentially the same entries, you just have to make more of them. And so here it is, you're transferring materials into production. Notice what you do: you debit your work in process and you credit raw materials inventory. That is no different than job order costing. Notice it's the same idea. You've got direct labor being used into production. Notice they're debiting work in process for the direct labor. And it's basically the same as job order costing. Now, the thing about the overhead, you can use more of a hybrid system. So if you use kind of like a predetermined overhead rate to do some allocations of overhead in a process costing system, you can do that, because remember, you can use departmental overhead rates. But it's the same idea. You debit work in process and you credit overhead for the allocated overhead amount, just like in chapters 3 and chapter 4. And if you look at this summary T account for work in process, just to remind you, here's product cost number 1, direct material, product cost number 2, direct labor, and product cost number 3, manufacturing overhead. Now, again, the one difference is once, in this case, this is shaping. So then once you're done with shaping, it's going to go to the next work in process department, or the next department, which they're going to call it insertion. So think of this as, this is work in process 1 department, I'll call it number 1. Then we go to another work in process, department number 2. And again, all you do is once you go from one WIP to the other WIP, you're going to credit this department or this account, and then you're going to be debiting the next one. So in this case, it says to record the transfer of cost out of the shaping department into the insertion department. All you do is it's a transfer between work in process accounts. You debit work in process for insertion, and you credit work in process for shaping. But it's still basically the same idea. You're still in work in process. Again, think process costing. The big difference is you're going to have multiple work in process departments. Okay, so this is exercise E5-28A, or it's a continuation of the previous one, but it's a basic idea. It says they want you to prepare journal entries to record the use of direct materials and direct labor and the allocation of overhead to a blending department. They also want to give the journal entry to record the cost of gallons completed and transferred out to the packaging department. So remember, that'll basically be, you'll go from one work in process department to another work. And so that's this type of entry, you'll be debiting one work in process account and crediting another work in process account. And then of course they want you to get the balance for the blending. So in the next couple slides, we'll walk you through those basic journal entries. So of course the assumption here is to do E5-28A, you have to basically know all of your numbers. And in 5-27A, that was the 5-step process to walk you through to get all of your costs. So you have to get the total physical units, you've got to get the equivalent units, you've got to get the cost to account for the cost per equivalent unit, and then you have to do the allocations. So if you look at this data, you'll notice that if you're going to walk through the steps for 27A, notice to get the total physical units, you can just take the 0 plus the 8,400 gallons. That would be a total of 8,400 units or 8,400 gallons to account for. That is your total physical units. That's an easy one. But of course, then notice when they give you the completed and ending WIP, the 6,200 plus the 2,200, notice that that also adds up to 8,400. So you know you can be reconciled right there. The only key is you have to deal with this 40%. That's an ending work in process. So if you were going to set that up to get your equivalent units, I would have something where, like, for example, I would have, maybe write it down below. You would have completed and transferred out, and then you'd have ending WIP. I would have the 6,200 units there. I would have the 2,200 units there. I always like to add a percent completion column, and I put 100% for completion. And then in ending work in process, it's 40% completed with respect to conversion. Now, if you go back up into the problem, I'm going to reference this. Wherever it says direct materials are added at the beginning of the processing and at the end of the packaging process, it says conversion costs are added evenly throughout each process. So that's going to be a key, because whenever you have to do equivalent units for one department, that's going to help you get the percent complete for each material or each component. And in this case, because this is going to be for blending, if materials are added at the beginning, that means 100% complete in the blending department. So if I were to draw a column, I'm going to say you have direct material and you have conversion. Again, this is to get your equivalent units. 100% times 6,200, you're going to transfer that across the board there, across the row. The bottom row for materials, it's going to be 100% because they told you it's at the beginning. So I know my material equivalent unit is 8,400. For conversion, you'd have to take the 40%. I'm just going to pencil this in 40% and multiply that out by 2,200 and then add that to the 6,200. That's how you would get that equivalent unit. So then once you've got that, that's your units. Then down here, now you have to deal with all the dollar amounts. So notice you've got beginning WIP is 0. You've got all these dollar amounts that you've added. There's your total dollar amount. So essentially what you're going to have to do is take the direct material amount, divide by the equivalent units. You can combine these and just say conversion. You'll divide those by your equivalent units to get your cost per equivalent unit. And again, you're going to have to do all this before you can do any journal entry, because you need to know the amounts. So we're going to assume that you already have the answer to 5-27A, and then this is just walking you through the basic idea of just the cost flow of the journal entries. So notice to requisition direct materials into blending or into production, you debit WIP and you simply credit raw materials. This is just like job costing. Direct labor, again, debit WIP, credit wages payable, or credit cash, however you want to do that. And then, of course, to allocate the overhead, again, you're going to debit WIP, credit manufacturing overhead. Notice these are exactly the same as you've already done. So really, this is review. And then the last step, again, you have to know all your averages, but this was to transfer the cost out of the blending into the packaging. You need to know your average cost per unit. So this will be a combined, your direct material plus your conversion cost per equivalent unit, which they gave you was $1.05. You'd have to multiply that times the 6,200 units, which is what you had completed and transferred out. If you take that times that 6,200, that's where they're getting that 6,510. You'd simply debit work in process packaging, credit work in process blending. And then the other basic idea is they want an ending balance for the blending. So that's the amount that would have been transferred out. These ending balances you would have determined by going back and multiplying by your individual cost per equivalent unit. So I'm just going to kind of give you a refer to E27A, and that's where you're going to get these amounts to be able to get the ending balance for WIP for that particular period. Okay, so the last objective of this is to show you what happens in the process costing system when you go to the next department. So the previous slides, the focus was just looking at the 5-step process on just one department. And now the next step is to show you what actually happens when you actually transfer those costs and those units into the next department. And again, so you'll note it's basically the same thing. It's the same process, the same 5-step process. The units we're going to call it that we transfer out, when you go to the next department, it's going to be called transferred in. Okay, and that's the one thing. You'll use those as you continue to calculate the equivalent units. And then, of course, you will look at those transferred in cost. And then the other thing you're going to look at is also, once you do transfer those into the next department, is any new costs that are added as well. Okay, so again, if you look at the step one, look, it's basically the same formula. So on the physical flow, notice how they take beginning WIP, and in the previous one we had units started. Well, now it's the same thing, but it's going to be called transferred in. So that's the one little thing that's going to change. It's transferred in rather than saying units started, but really it's the same idea. So again, you take the beginning WIP plus the units you just transferred into that department, and then that's going to give you the total physical flow. And then look at the reconciliation of it. How many units were completed and transferred out, plus ending WIP. This one's really the same, and notice that these numbers are also the same as well. So again, you'll notice, again, as you're looking at your equivalent units, you'll see how we still have the direct material column and the conversion column, and then the third one you actually add is the transferred in. That's the new one. But if you look at the setup, it's really the same. So down here, when you're doing the equivalent units, notice you've got, again, completed and transferred out, plus the ending WIP. And typically, the transferred in units will always be at 100%. So that's why if you notice, this is 38 and 7. And then, of course, they will have to give you the percent complete for the materials and the conversion. And then, of course, the last step is to, again, get the equivalent units. And then eventually you'll divide by this in the denominator to get the average cost per equivalent unit. And then, again, you'll notice in this illustration for your steps 3 and 4, when you're trying, again, to come up with the total cost to account for and the cost per equivalent unit. Remember, everything here is still in work in process. It's just the next department. And you'll notice that again here you've got transferred in, direct materials, conversion cost. You'll notice that you have your total dollars is in this row right here for all of them. You always take the beginning WIP plus, notice it says dollars added, and then you divide by your equivalent units, and then the very last row here is your cost per equivalent unit. And then finally, once you do have your cost per equivalent unit, you can do your allocation and assignment of cost. and you're really doing the same thing. You're going to assign cost to what you completed and transferred out. That's right here. And then you're also going to assign cost to the ending work in process. So kind of almost kind of like that's one, that's two, that's the two things you're doing in step 5. And of course here, I'm just kind of highlighting, here's your cost per equivalent unit. You're multiplying it again by the completed and transferred out. So I'm going to circle these represent the total cost right there that are being transferred out. The total is 199.5, and then you go back to your ending work in process, and again you go back individually and multiply by your cost per equivalent unit, and then lo and behold you get the ending work in process. You add these two together to reconcile it. That should tie back to your total cost to account for.